The soul catcher of Blackwood Estate, the sound of the hounds. They tell you the North Star is the way to freedom. They tell you to follow the moss on the trees, to stay in the water to hide your scent, to keep your heart quiet so the master can't hear it beating through the floorboards. But in South Carolina, in the year 1854, there was a place where the North Star went dim. The Blackwood Estate wasn't just a plantation. It was a throat, and once you were swallowed, you didn't come back out. My name is Silas. I was 18 years old the night I decided I'd rather be a ghost in the swamp than a dog in the fields. I had nothing but a rusted iron knife, a scrap of my mother's quilt, and a fear so deep it felt like a second heartbeat. The moon was a sliver of bone in a bruised sky. I stood at the edge of the hanging moss swamp, the water blacker than the ink in the master's ledger. Behind me, I heard them, the hounds, but something was wrong. Usually the Blackwood hounds bayed with a hunger that could chill your marrow. Tonight, they were screaming, not the bark of a hunter, but the high, thin shriek of a creature being unmade. I didn't wait to see what was making them scream. I stepped into the water. The white shadow, the swamp doesn't just hold water, it holds breath. Every step I took, the mud tried to pull my boots off. A slow, wet suction like the earth was trying to taste my skin. The elders, Old Man Moses and Auntie May, they used to whisper about the white shadow. They said Master Blackwood didn't need a sheriff to find runaways. He had a silent guardian. They said 40 years ago, Blackwood lost his only son to the swamp, and in his madness, he called out to the dark water. Something answered. I didn't believe in the old stories. I believed in the lash. I believed in the brand. I believed in the reality of the pain on my back, until I saw the trees move. It wasn't a wind. There was no breeze in the bayou. It was a ripple in the fog, a pale, elongated shape that moved through the cypress knees like mercury. It was 10 feet tall, thin as a willow branch, and dressed in rags that looked like rotted burial shrouds. But it was the face that stopped my heart. It wasn't a face at all. It was a porcelain mask, cracked down the center, glowing with a faint, sickly moonlight. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, white surface that seemed to drink the light. It wasn't hunting me, not yet. It was hunting the men who were hunting me. The accounting behind me, the lanterns of the slave catchers cut through the mist. I recognized the voices. Graves and Miller, 2 men who enjoyed their work far too much. I am, Miller shouted. The boys heading for the deep channel, get the dogs. But the dogs wouldn't move. I watched from the shadows of a fallen oak as the 2 massive bloodhounds, beasts that had torn men to pieces, cowered in the mud, their ears flat, whimpering like newborn pups. Then the sound started, click, click, click. Graves raised his lantern. What the hell is that? The fog parted. The white shadow was standing 10 feet behind them. It didn't make a sound when it moved. It just appeared. Its limbs were too long, its fingers ending in blackened, needle-like points. Miller turned, his shotgun raised. He was a man who feared nothing. He fired. The blast was deafening. Birdshot shredded the moss. But the white shadow didn't flinch. The lead seemed to pass through it like it was made of smoke. The creature reached out. Its hand was a blur of motion. It didn't strike, it touched. It placed a single, spindly finger on Miller's forehead. Miller didn't scream. He simply stopped. His eyes went wide, the color draining out of them instantly, turning them as white as the creature's mask. He stood there, frozen, as his skin began to gray and shrivel, his very life force being pulled through that single point of contact. Graves dropped his lantern. The glass shattered. The oil caught fire on the surface of the swamp water, casting dancing, orange demons against the trees. Graves ran. He ran right toward me. The bargain, I crouched lower. The heat of the fire was on my face, but the air around the creature was freezing. As Graves stumbled past my hiding spot, he tripped over a submerged root. He looked up and saw me. Silas, Silas, help me. For God's sake, boy. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. This was the man who had branded my shoulder 3 months ago. This was the man who had sold my mother downriver for a bottle of rye. I looked at him. Then I looked at the white shadow. The creature was gliding toward us. It didn't walk, it drifted. The clicking sound was louder now, a frantic, mechanical heartbeat. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the scrap of my mother's quilt. It was the only thing I had that carried her scent, the scent of lye soap and dried jasmine. As the creature drew closer, it stopped. The porcelain mask tilted to the side, looking not at Graves, but at the cloth in my hand. I realized then what the white shadow was. It wasn't just a monster. It was a vessel. It was made of the grief of every soul that had been broken on the Blackwood estate. It was the physical manifestation of every prayer that had gone unanswered. I threw the cloth, not at the monster but at Graves. The cloth landed on Graves' chest. The creature let out a sound, not a voice, but a chorus of 1,000 whispers, all of them crying out at once. It lunged. It didn't want the cloth. It wanted the man who had caused the grief that made the cloth necessary. I didn't stay to watch the end. I turned and ran into the deepest part of the swamp, the screams of Graves fading behind me, replaced by the sound of the fire hissing as it met the water. The price of freedom. I ran for 3 days. My feet were shredded, my lungs were raw, and my mind was a fractured mirror of the things I'd seen. I eventually found the river. I found the hidden boat the elders told me about. And I found the North. But freedom isn't what they tell you it is. It isn't the absence of a master. It's the presence of a memory. Every night when the house goes quiet, I hear it. Click, click, click. The white shadow didn't let me go because I was innocent. It let me go because I am its witness. I am the one who tells the story. I am the one who ensures that Master Blackwood and men like him never sleep in peace, knowing that in the dark, in the water, in the places where they think they are safe, God remembers. And so does the swamp. My name is Silas, and I am the only man who ever escaped the Blackwood estate. But sometimes I think I'm still running. They say that if you go to the edge of the hanging moss swamp today, you won't find the plantation. The forest reclaimed the brick and the bone long ago. But they say that on the nights when the moon is a sliver of bone, the fog still smells of rotted burial shrouds and burnt oil. And if you listen very carefully, you can still hear the sound of a clock being wound too tight, waiting for the next debt to be paid. The Soul Catcher, Chapter 2, The Urban Fog, the Weight of the North. They call it the city of brotherly love. But to a man who spent 18 years under the South Carolina sun, Philadelphia in the winter of 1860 felt like a tomb made of brick and ice. I had been free for 6 years. I had a name, Silas Penhaligon. I had a job as a night watchman at a textile mill on the edge of the Schuylkill River. I had a small room in a boarding house that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool. I was free. That's what the papers said. That's what the abolitionists told me at the Sunday meetings. But freedom has a funny way of feeling like a different kind of cage. In the swamp, I was running from the whip. In the city, I was running from the silence. Because every time the world went quiet, I expected to hear the water ripples. I expected to smell the rot. And then the fog came. It wasn't the light misty rain of the north. It was thick, yellow, heavy with the soot of 1,000 coal fires. It crawled up from the river like a living thing, swallowing the gaslights until the streets were nothing but pockets of dim, flickering orange in a sea of gray. That was the night the clicking started again. The echo in the brick. I was making my rounds at the mill. The machinery was silent, great iron looms sitting like sleeping beasts in the dark. I carried a lantern in one hand and a heavy oak club in the other. Click, click, click. I froze. My heart, which I thought I had tamed, hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the vibration of the fog against the windows. No answer. Only the sound of the river pressing against the pilings outside. I moved to the back loading dock. The door was heavy timber, reinforced with iron. It was bolted from the inside. But as I drew closer, I saw something that made the marrow in my bones turn to slush. Water was seeping under the door. Not river water. This was thick, black, and smelled of cypress needles and rotted jasmine. I stepped back, my lantern swinging wildly. The light hit the wall, and for a split second I saw a shadow. It wasn't my shadow. It was too long. Its limbs were jointed like a spider's, and it reached from the floor all the way to the rafters. And on the wall, in the center of that shadow's head, was the unmistakable outline of a cracked porcelain mask. The visitor from the past. "You can't be here," I whispered. "I left you in the water. I left you with graves." The clicking intensified. It was coming from the shadows behind the looms. I turned, raising my lantern high. The white shadow didn't glide this time. It unfolded. It stepped out from behind a massive steam boiler, its spindly, bone-white fingers trailing across the iron. Where it touched the metal, the iron frosted over, turning brittle and gray. It stood a head taller than the ceiling joists, its neck craned at a sickening angle. The porcelain mask was exactly as I remembered, the same jagged crack, the same smooth, eyeless surface. But it wasn't attacking. It was pointing. One long, needle-sharp finger extended toward the window, toward the city beyond the mill. I didn't understand, not until the fog shifted outside, and I saw a carriage pulling up to the counting house across the street. A man stepped out. He was old, wrapped in a coat of fine wolf fur, carrying a silver-headed cane. He looked like any other wealthy merchant in Philadelphia. But as the gaslight hit his face, I saw the birthmark on his jaw, a jagged red shape like a lightning bolt. It was Master Blackwood's brother, Julian Blackwood, the man who handled the finances for the estate, the man who had signed the bills of sale for every child taken from my mother's arms. He hadn't just watched the horror, he had profited from it. And now he was here, in the north, safe, respected. The white shadow let out that chorus of 1,000 whispers. It wasn't a sound of hunger. It was a sound of instruction. The debt collector. I realized then that I was wrong about the creature. It hadn't followed me to haunt me. It had followed me because I was its pointer. It didn't know the city. It didn't know the names on the ledgers or the faces behind the fur coats. But I did. The white shadow was the weapon, but I was the hand that held it. Julian Blackwood walked toward his office, his boots clicking on the cobblestones. He looked over his shoulder, a sudden chill catching him. He pulled his collar tighter, unaware that death was standing 12 feet away, separated only by a pane of glass and 6 years of accumulated rage. The creature moved closer to me, its cold breath smelling like the deepest part of the swamp. It held out its hand, palm up. It was waiting for a sign. If I stayed silent, the creature would fade back into the fog. Julian Blackwood would go inside, drink his brandy, and die an old man in a warm bed, never answering for the lives he'd traded for his gold. But if I spoke, I looked at the creature's mask. I thought about the quilt scrap I'd thrown at graves. I thought about my mother, who was likely buried in a grave I'd never find, in a state that didn't even recognize her name. "He's the one," I whispered. The clicking stopped instantly. The price of witnessing. The white shadow didn't even open the door. It simply ceased to be in the room and appeared on the street. Julian Blackwood never even had time to scream. I watched from the window as the fog surged around him like a tidal wave. I saw the wolf fur coat flutter. I saw the silver cane hit the stones with a dull thud. And then there was only the fog. When the police arrived an hour later, they found Julian Blackwood slumped against his office door. There wasn't a mark on him, no blood, no struggle. The doctors would later say it was a sudden failure of the heart. But I knew better. I saw his face before they covered it. His skin was the color of old ash. His eyes were wide, white, and empty. And pinned to his chest, held by nothing but the chill of the air, was a single, rotted jasmine flower. I went back to my room that night. I sat in the dark, listening to the city breathe. I am free, that's what they say. But now I know the truth. The white shadow isn't a guardian, and it isn't just a ghost. It's a hunger that I have unleashed. And it's still waiting, because Julian was just one name on a very, very long list. In the morning, the fog cleared. The sun came up over Philadelphia, bright and cold. But the people on the street moved a little faster. They kept their heads down. They felt a weight in the air they couldn't explain. Silas Penhaligon sits in his room looking at his hands. He is a free man, but he knows that tonight the sun will go down again. The fog will return, and the clicking will start, because justice isn't a fire that burns out, it's a debt, and Silas has just become the bookkeeper. The Soul Catcher, Chapter 3, The Other Witnesses, The Ash on the Wind. Julian Blackwood was buried in a cemetery that cost more than the lives of everyone I had ever loved. The papers called it a tragedy. They called it a mysterious ailment of the heart. But I knew. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the jasmine flower pinned to his chest. I saw the way the light had been vacuumed out of his sockets. I tried to stay in my room. I tried to pretend that I was just a night watchman again. But the air in Philadelphia had changed. It was no longer just soot and sea salt. It was heavy with the scent of stagnant swamp water. And then came the letter. It wasn't delivered by the postman. I found it tucked into the frame of my mirror, a piece of parchment so old it felt like dried skin. There was no ink. The words were burned into the paper, as if by a hot wire. "The ledger is long, Silas, but you are not the only one holding the pen." Underneath the words was an address, a cellar in the 7th Ward, a place where the sun never touched the cobblestones. The cellar of broken shadows. The 7th Ward was a labyrinth of bone-chilling alleyways and lean-tos. I arrived at midnight, my hand white-knuckled around the grip of my club. I found the door, a rotted slab of cedar marked with a faint, white porcelain circle. I descended. The cellar was lit by a single, guttering candle. In the center of the room sat a woman. She was older than time itself, her skin a map of scars and stories. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, but she looked directly at me as if she could see the very atoms of my soul. "You're the boy from Blackwood," she said. Her voice sounded like dry leaves skittering over a grave. "How do you know that?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Because your shadow smells like cypress and salt." she replied. She gestured to the corners of the room. Look around, Silas. You think you're special. You think you're the only one the water followed north. I raised my lantern. The light didn't push back the dark. It only revealed what was hiding in it. There were others. A man with no tongue. A girl with branded palms. A grandmother clutching a rusted chain. And behind each of them, tucked into the architecture of the shadows, stood a figure. Spindly limbs, ragged shrouds, porcelain masks. A dozen white shadows standing in perfect, terrifying stillness. A private army of the damned, waiting in the belly of the city. The hunter of ghosts. We are the witnesses, the old woman said. Her name was Martha. We are the ones who survived the unsurvivable. And because we didn't die, the grief didn't die either. It took shape. It became these things. Why am I here? I asked, looking at the creature standing behind Martha. Its mask was cracked horizontally, like a mouth frozen in a permanent scream. Because the balance is shifting, Martha whispered. The masters, they aren't just merchants and planters anymore. They've realized we're here, and they've hired someone to hunt us. Not a man with a whip, a man with a bell. Clang. The shadows in the room reacted instantly. They didn't lunge, they vibrated. Their porcelain masks began to hairline fracture. The clicking sound, that mechanical heartbeat, turned into a frantic, chaotic buzzing. He's here, Martha gasped, her blind eyes widening. The Sin Eater. The silence of the bell. A man stepped into the cellar. He was dressed in a suit of funeral black, his face hidden behind a veil of heavy lace. In his left hand, he carried a small silver bell. In his right, a long, serrated blade etched with strange, glowing symbols. He didn't look at us. He looked at the shadows. He rang the bell again. The sound did something to the air. It was a frequency of pure erasure. I watched in horror as the shadow behind the tongueless man began to dissolve. The porcelain mask shattered into white dust, and the spindly limbs turned to gray smoke. The man, the witness, let out a cry of agony. It was as if his very memory of the plantation was being ripped out of his brain. When the shadow vanished, he collapsed, his eyes turning into empty, white voids. He wasn't dead. He was hollowed. The Sin Eater doesn't kill the body, Martha hissed, grabbing my arm. He kills the witness. He erases the crime so the master can sleep in peace. Run, Silas. If he rings that bell for your shadow, you'll forget who you are. You'll forget her. I thought of my mother. I thought of the jasmine. The Sin Eater turned toward me. The veil fluttered as he tilted his head. He raised the silver bell. The escape into the dark, I didn't think. I lunged. Not at the man, but at the candle. The cellar plunged into absolute darkness. In the black, the bell rang again, but the sound was muffled by the heavy stone walls. I felt a cold hand grab my collar, not the hand of a man, but the needle-sharp fingers of my shadow. It didn't pull me down, it pulled me up. I felt myself being dragged through the floorboards, through the brick, through the very fabric of the building. It was a sensation of being unmade and restitched in a single second. I tumbled out onto the wet cobblestones of the alleyway. The fog was there to catch me. I looked back at the cellar door. A faint, silver light was pulsing from the cracks in the wood. Then, silence. My shadow stood over me, its mask glowing with a frantic, pulsing rhythm. It was terrified. For the first time, the predator had become the prey. I am Silas Penhaligon. I came north to find freedom, but I found a war between those who remember and those who want the world to forget. The Sin Eater is coming for the ledger, and I am the only bookkeeper left who can run. The gaslights of Philadelphia are flickering tonight. If you walk through the 7th Ward, You might find a cellar with a shattered door and the smell of burnt porcelain. But don't stay long, because there is a man in a funeral suit walking the streets. He doesn't want your money. He doesn't want your life. He just wants your silence. And if you hear the chime of a silver bell, it's already too late to remember. The Soul Catcher, Chapter 4, The Harvest of Sound, The Weight of the Void. The Seventh Ward was dead. The witnesses were gone, either hollowed out into mindless shells or scattered like ash into the Philadelphia fog. I was the last bookkeeper left. I sat in my boarding house room, the door barred with iron. My shadow was no longer standing. It was crouched in the corner, its porcelain mask covered in fine, spiderweb cracks. It was dying. Every time the sin eater rang that silver bell in the city, a piece of my mother's face faded from my mind. I realized then that the sin eater wasn't just a hunter, he was a thief. He was stealing the only thing we had left, our right to have been hurt. I won't let you, I whispered to the dark. I won't forget. But I knew I couldn't hide. The bell was a frequency that found you anywhere. I needed a sound louder than erasure. I needed a sound that carried the weight of the world. I needed the great bell of St. Jude's, the tower of brass. St. Jude's Cathedral stood like a jagged tooth against the skyline. Its bell tower was the highest point in the city, housing a 10-ton brass monster that hadn't been rung in 20 years. They said the sound was so powerful it cracked the stained glass in the nave. I climbed. My shadow dragged itself behind me, its limbs heavy and translucent. The gear room was a forest of rust and iron. I reached the belfry just as the fog began to glow with that sickly, silver light. Clang. The sin eater was at the base of the stairs. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He just climbed, one rhythmic step at a time, ringing that small, silver bell. Clang! With every ring, my shadow let out a shriek of static. Its porcelain mask began to flake away, revealing nothing but black smoke underneath. I felt my own memories flickering. I forgot the color of my mother's eyes. I forgot the name of the boy who died for a piece of bread. Silas. 1,000 whispers cried out from my shadow. It hurts to exist. The sin eater's face. The sin eater stepped onto the belfry floor. The wind whipped his funeral veil, revealing the truth beneath the lace. He had no face. Where a man's features should have been, there was only a smooth, silver mirror. He was a reflection of the masters who hired him. He was the perfect silence. He raised his serrated blade, the symbols on the steel glowing with a violent, white light. He didn't want my life. He wanted to carve the shadow out of me and leave me a hollow man, a man who would go back to work, bow his head, and never speak of Blackwood again. "You think you can erase us?" I screamed, stepping toward the great bell. "You think we're just ink on a ledger?" The sin eater rang the silver bell one last time, pointing it directly at my heart. The vibration hit me like a physical blow. My shadow collapsed, its porcelain mask shattering completely. I fell to my knees, the name of my mother dancing on the edge of a void, ready to fall into the dark forever. The hymn of the damned. I didn't reach for my club. I reached for the pull rope of the great bell. I threw my entire weight into it. Boom. The sound didn't just ring, it shook the foundations of the city. It was a frequency of pure, unadulterated existence. Boom! The sin eater's silver bell shattered in his hand. The crystalline chime was swallowed by the roar of the brass. I began to sing, not a song of war, but the old spiritual my mother sang in the kitchen of the Whitmore estate. A song about a promised land. A song about Moses. Boom! With every strike of the great bell, my shadow didn't just reform, it expanded. It drank the sound. The black smoke poured out of me, mixing with the smoke of the other witnesses who had been hollowed. The air in the belfry became a cyclone of shadows, thousands of them, all of them finding their voices in the vibration of the brass. The sin-eater backed away, his mirror face cracking. For the first time, he was seeing what he had tried to erase. He was seeing the weight of the dead, the unforgettable ending. The shadow didn't kill the sin-eater. It did something worse. It poured into him. Thousands of lives, thousands of memories, thousands of traumas were forced into that empty, silver vessel. The sin-eater's mirror face turned into 1,000 different faces, all of them screaming, all of them crying, all of them finally being heard. The man in the funeral suit collapsed. He didn't disappear. He became a heap of rotted rags and rusted silver, a monument to the crimes he could no longer hide. I stood in the silence of the belfry as the sun began to rise over Philadelphia. My shadow was different now. It wasn't a monster. It was a tall, quiet figure that looked almost like a man. It leaned against the brass bell, its porcelain mask gone, replaced by a face that looked remarkably like the father I never knew. I am Silas Penhaligon. I am no longer running. The masters are still out there. They are still in their mansions, still counting their gold, still hoping the world will forget. But the sin-eater is dead, and the witnesses have found a new way to speak. Every time the wind whistles through the bricks of this city, every time a bell rings in the distance, every time a child asks what happened before, that's us. We are the memory that won't be erased. And Master Blackwood, if you're listening, God remembers. And so do I if you go to St. Jude's Cathedral today. They say the great bell is still silent. They say the gears are too rusted to move. But sometimes, on a foggy night in the 7th Ward, the people look up at the tower. They see a tall, dark shape standing near the brass, and they swear they can hear a low, rhythmic humming, a song about a land beyond the river. The ledger is closed, but the story is just beginning.